Hello, guys. Good morning, good afternoon. This is Daniel from Danisoft. We're having today a session together with Actian, and we have Luis, Alex, and Helena from Actian. The topic today is basically to have an update for partners on Actian then and an update in general as well. We will have a raffle or a draw for an extended evaluation, and Helena will do this. We will send the email, the winner by email later on the details. And excuse me. And I want to thank Luis and Alex and Helena for the time. And I will pass to Luis. I think is the first one. So thank you for and welcome to the session.
Well, thank you so much, Daniel. And before we get going, I think we want to have Helena talk a bit about what we're trying to achieve and logistically how we're going to go about doing that.
Hi everyone, this is Helena. So after the presentation, we've got a simple app that we will use. I will collect the names of the participants and then we'll do the draw. We have 3 extended evaluations to give out. So stay tuned, stay till the end of the webinar, and we'll keep our fingers crossed for you so that you win. Thank you.
Thank you, Helena. And I'd like to thank Danisoft again for giving us the opportunity to talk to you today. So with that, let me get started. My name is Louis Carr, and I'm in charge of product marketing and product management for our data management products. And along with me, I have my partner in crime here, Alex Sherwood, who is the Director of Sales Programs.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning, depending on where you are.
Thank you. Good morning, Alex. So we're going to play a bit of tag team so you don't get too bored with hearing the same voice the whole time. And I apologize for us speaking in English. In my case, it's because aside from a bit of Japanese, I'm not exactly multilingual. But also, we are fortunate enough to have an audience that spans 3 different countries and 3 different languages, and we'd have to pick one anyway, so why not English? So with that, I'd like to get going now. The first thing is to consider, as you'll see as we talk about Actian today, is that the company that we're part of, it's changing and broadening. But even with that, our claim to fame, what we focus on, is data management, integration, and analytics support. That's our sweet spot. That's what our core expertise is. As you saw with the title to the actual webinar that we're presenting, it said building intelligent applications at the edge. Well, what we hope to impress upon you today is the fact that as these applications become more sophisticated, more intelligent, they become more distributed, going from the data center out to the cloud and from the cloud out into the edge. The importance of the data management and integration within these applications, the need to handle analytics is going to be to grow so much that it's going to be imperative that you select the right data management, integration, and analytics support for those applications. So in essence, that's what we're trying to get across today. Now, Actian, as I mentioned, many of you are familiar with P-SQL, which is the forerunner, both in terms of the underlying code base and architecture, to what we're going to talk about today, Zen. But it is even a successor to a set of code that many of you, depending upon your age and how long you've been working in this space around data management, may remember as B-Tree. But over that period of time, particularly in the last 5 years, the company that built P-SQL was merged with several other companies, and the the outcome of those acquisitions and mergers is Actian. And Actian, again, is really focused on just data management, integration, and analytics. What we've seen, though, over the last 10 years is that focus has to be looking at the market from a standpoint of everything is about hybrid data. And hybrid data, it's probably worthwhile to give it a bit of a definition. When we talk about hybrid data, we're talking about data that has to handle environments that are both cloud and on-premise. And for that matter, on-premise has changed. On-premise isn't just in the data center, on-premise is out at the edge, and henceforth the reason we have intelligent applications. Hybrid data is about the fact that all data is no longer structured. There's plenty of unstructured data, and the combination of them is really where you find the points at the sweet spot in which the analytics yield you better business outcomes through providing you better actionable intelligence. So there's much more to hybrid data, and we should probably put up a blog or point you at some topics that describe it in more detail that we certainly can't get to in the time allotted. But suffice it to say that we've been looking at data for 20, 30 years, particularly if you look at the pedigree of those of us that are involved with formerly P-SQL and now, as we'll talk about, Zen. As a result of the mergers and acquisitions, we're over 100 million in revenue. Our install base of customers across all of the different products from all the different companies that have come together is over 10,000 customers. And we are seen as a leading vendor within Silicon Valley. As a result of what we've done, we've been fortunate enough to attract attention from a very large systems integrator historically from India, HCL, along with a leading Silicon Valley investment firm called Sumero. And the two of them last year in July came together to buy us. And even though we're still operating independently with members of both of those organizations on our board, we are leveraging them, but at the same time, being allowed to work independently to ensure that our innovation continues and their investments simply accelerate that innovation. Now, again, with all the different products that we have across data management, integration, and analytics support, in the time we have allotted, it would be very difficult to talk about them all. So what we want to talk to you about today, specifically because we're talking about edge applications and edge intelligence, is Actian Zen. And Actian Zen, to be clear, is the latest manifestation, latest version of P-SQL. Now, as hopefully you will see through the rest of what we say today, what we've done to extend that code base, to extend that architecture, to automate, tune, and optimize it, really prepares it and sets it up as the best platform from a data management standpoint to support edge applications. Even without what we've done in innovation going forward with Actian Zen, based on the P-SQL product, we have over 5,000 customers and millions of users dating back to 1982, with compatibility of the code dating back to 1994. And think about the versions of Windows or Linux or many of the other underlying operating environments. The ability to have backward compatibility across all of those changes is something that, quite frankly, I feel we could pat ourselves on the back for. What's happened since then, again, in terms of optimizing and improving the functionality is taking advantage of things like multi-core CPU support, or the ability to virtualize in virtual machines, the ability to handle containers, the ability to work across multiple operating environments. These are some of the core things that we've done to innovate on that code base. And the reason we needed to do that is that this edge computing environment has really changed things. We've gone from where you have a set of silos that were not terribly intelligent to a set of things that are connected and have more intelligence. But even still, they're not to the point where we expect them to be over the next 10 years, where these connected things will interact with each other. They'll have to share data with each other. They'll have to learn from each other. They'll have to share data back with that cloud and that core environment in such a way that this intelligent edge really becomes the point of action where you're going to see much more in the way of the analytics localized to that point of action. So just briefly to recap on then and now. If you look at what we had in the 1990s, and for many of us, and you can't see us, but for many of us, we've been working in this space since the 1990s, if not the 1980s. And the environment that P-SQL started out with, and before that B-Tree, was one in which you had thick clients going to on-premise servers, particularly at the edge. That was the edge. The edge didn't extend to sensors and mobile phones. And the type of code that was part of the underlying systems was literally proprietary. Now, there was some structure in terms of how you built that proprietary code. There were some guidelines used, things like object-oriented programming. And over time, by the 2000s, that became service-oriented architecture. The underlying physical resources began to abstract in multiple layers. We all know the whole concept of a hardware abstraction layer, for example. And then we began with service-oriented architecture to virtualize the underlying hardware resources. And as we looked at service-oriented architecture, we tried to begin to evaluate and remove a lot of the point-to-point connections, which then means that you abstract all of the software layers as well. And through all of this, as you do that Internet of Things, or this whole network, you begin to look at, well, what's the bandwidth and how do I transfer the data around between all of these new software modules? And over this time, over the 20-year period, we've gone to an environment which is no longer simply or strictly client server. Everything has become virtualized. At the end of that virtualized environment, at that edge, you've got mobile phones that are now equivalent of what a desktop was 10 years ago, with multiple applications. And increasingly, these applications are being used for business critical functions. And as they're used for business critical functions, particularly as those applications get into the cloud and they're distributed across multiple vendors, locally on that particular mobile device, you're having to increasingly handle data that's used across those multiple applications locally. You're also beginning to see much more that there's specialized versions of these mobile devices with specialized pieces of the applications that are vertical or task specific, and those are found in these branch offices in the remote field. It really started with things like the ATM machine in a bank, or the ability to handle smart meters. And as we move forward, you're just seeing an increase in the level of that set of intelligent things or Internet of Things out there that aren't just human to machine, but even machine to machine. And as we see much more intelligence out there, in parallel, we're seeing this rapid change and update of the underlying software, and the ability to look at, if I really want to move faster than my competition, and everything is based on the intellectual property within that software, then I have to be concerned with the ability to do multiple types of software configurations, scenarios, and even features and functions in the code in parallel, something we call A/B testing. And the techniques and the process and the culture developed to support that is often called agile delivery. So with this as a background, and I'll leave it to you to read through all of the lists here, you can really reflect and see the contrast between then and now. But what this means is a real change in what you see in terms of the requirements for data management to support this changed environment. Now we have to worry about a difference in the deployments. It can be a very different deployment to deploy into the cloud, a very different deployment to deploy to a mobile handset, which is being used by a human, versus deploying to a gateway where there may not even be humans, let alone out into the various devices on the other side of a gateway. In such environments, it's very uncontrolled, and there aren't resources available to manage whatever compute resources you have in that environment. So it changes your philosophy and your config and how you manage that particular technology out there. But the fact of the matter is that technology is rapidly moving out there, and that technology supports the way businesses go forward and transform into digital businesses. So we have to look at that transformation as having a parallel transformation for the data itself. Not just the data in terms of the way it's being used in the application, but also data from a standpoint of how you're managing and monitoring those applications and devices. So the metadata management becomes just as important, both for performance and security and for the ability to update and maintain things, particularly that agile delivery environment. The other issue is it's not just mobile or IoT. The fact of the matter is that mobile in some ways is a subset of IoT. And that both of these environments have much more in the way of security vulnerabilities that have to be tackled through a data-driven approach. For all of this, how do you build a platform from a data management standpoint? And how do you build it in such a way that it doesn't splinter and fragment? How do you keep it standardized? How do you consolidate it? And that's a problem that we've been thinking about for over 2 decades. With all the 5,000 customers that we've worked with for P-SQL, it's given us the ability to look back and say, you know, what if I had a database that allowed me to run on a very small device all the way out at the edge, and then I modularly added functionality to that database without ever changing as I move forward out into multiple functions, what that core looks like. Could I build a single scalable architecture that would support parts of applications or local applications across that entire environment? And what if I made sure that that database was capable of handling the user authentication and access and was able to handle encryption of that data when it's at rest in the data tables inside of that database, as well as when I'm taking that data and transmitting it out between the databases. So in other words, when it's in transit, not just at rest. And if I could build that database where it would go across all these environments, I want to make sure that it would handle all of the existing databases and data integration points within those environments, because I need to face the reality that that is the reality, that there are many databases out there and people have invested in them and they're not going to rapidly remove them. But at the same time, where it's a green field or where I begin to evolve and migrate off of those databases, I could have the opportunity to do a single scalable architecture across that entire environment. And that's what we've been focused on with Zen, is to actually build on top of P-SQL something modular and scalable that would go down from the server environment that P-SQL worked in all the way down into a device, yet also go up into a virtual machine container environment up into the cloud for multi-tenant use. And that's what we're going to talk about in much more detail today, is the fact that we built out something that does that very thing. So what you see here is the ability to use Zen both in that traditional client server environment for remote branch and field, but also back into a cloud environment, as well as out to the IoT devices. And we'll talk about the specifics of each of these versions. But in addition to that, we've ensured that Zen, formerly P-SQL, will work with our data integration software such that we can pull in data into the database from any number of existing applications, both traditional applications that we would expect to see like SAP or Oracle, but also cloud applications, Salesforce, Workday, etc. So we can use Data Connect to do that. Then on top of that database, we can shift data back into our vector database in order to perform very high speed, multi-terabyte to multi-petabyte types of analytics, both ad hoc as well as to support building the machine language intelligence necessary to then push back down in pieces out to the edge environment that could even run on top of Zen. So that's the environment that we have. And I think it's probably worthwhile to talk a bit about how that environment comes together from a technical standpoint, particularly when it comes to ETL. So I'm going to turn it over to Alex to talk a bit about that.
Thanks, Louis. One of the things that we've seen a lot of in talking to customers who are either thinking about expanding their existing application to add mobile components or single board computer type applications, say on a Raspbian or a Intel Neutrino. And especially true for customers who are looking at building out IoT solutions, is they typically start with open source data management throughout their stack. And that makes a lot of sense from some perspective. You know, a lot of it is very well built for particular use cases, and the fact that it sounds like it's free, at least there's no charge for licensing, seems like a pretty good place to start. The problem, though, is that when you begin to have a group of different databases, and this example here is just it's a hypothetical factory where you have a pump that may be instrumented to collect and store data, either something like Berkeley DB or a flat file. And that pump is connected to a gateway along with several other pumps feeding data to the gateway on something like a Raspberry Pi running MySQL. Maybe there's a mobile component for support staff, and that's going to be using SQLite. Back at the factory, you may have Postgres running on Linux on the factory floor, and all of that stuff is connected back to the enterprise via the cloud doing analytics. The issue here is that every time you want to move data from one database to another, you need to extract it, transform it, and load it to the other database. So if I want to move from Berkeley DB to SQLite, I have to match data type formats and records so that my single record going from my pump is something that I can read on my mobile phone. And that requires an integration component and transform. And that's true for every pair of databases in this picture. Now, to be fair, it's not often you're going to see somebody build out an entire stack of open source products, but this is, it's not an unusual conversation to have. And the thing that happens here is you find yourself as a developer spending a huge amount of time building all of that integration code that's specific to your application. And it's not just the one time. Anytime those database changes, anytime you need to expand the application in any one of these places, so mobile, at the pump, on the gateway, in the factory, you need to change the integration code again. So that is the challenge that people are faced with when they're trying to build out a full IoT stack, or even when they're just trying to add a mobile component to their existing app. With Zen, there's a different approach. If you have a single data platform across your entire stack, then there is no ETL required. So there's no integration code required to be built. That is a huge advantage for somebody who's building out an application. The other big deal here is that is a security perspective. If you have a requirement to transform data, say from the edge back into the factory, and you have a different data format from one end to the other, you're going to need to unencrypt your data before you transform it and then move it and then re-encrypt it. That creates a security vector. So with Zen, you eliminate all of those things. And the net result from a developer perspective is you're able to focus much, much more on getting your solution built and adding features as opposed to creating a lot of integration code. This scenario here, moving from a very complex integration software requirement that has security flaws to a single platform, is one of the big reasons people are talking to us about Zen in the IoT space. So let's kind of jump into the Zen architecture, and you may be familiar with this if you've been using this product for a while. We have both SQL and NoSQL access. With V13, we have added some new languages for access methods through the btrieve2 API. So now if you're a Python, C# or PHP or Perl developer, you can write directly to the btrieve API. We have all of the 0 dBA features that you're used to, so self-tuning, auto defrag, auto reconnect. It's been around for a while. Auto defrag is new. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. As Lewis mentioned before, we're backward compatible, which is really key for our classic customer base, because if you've got thousands of users out there, you want to make sure that a patch or a new release isn't going to break your app ever. And while that's very important for the small to mid-sized business application, is absolutely essential in the IoT space. I guess the newest things that we're going to be talking about today is support for brand new OS and hardware platforms that you can see on this list. So Android, iOS, Raspbian, Windows IoT, and in addition to Intel, we're now running on ARM. And underneath all of that, and this is again what allows us to enable people to quickly build out an IoT stack or add a mobile component to their app, is that common Zen data format. And that means that data file that I create on my Android phone or my Apple phone can be read with no changes on Zen on Linux, on Windows, on Mac OS, or on Raspbian.
So this is Lewis again. I think from that you can see that we have really made market improvement in the architecture in such a way that we are achieving the goal of creating a single secure, scalable architecture. I just want to remind you, though, that the reason we believe that that's necessary is that the environment that we're going into is not necessarily always controlled. It's distributed. It is dealing with business critical conditions and outcome requirements. In a nutshell, it's an enterprise environment, and therefore it requires enterprise grade features. So part of that is, if you're going to have something enterprise grade and it needs to be secure, scalable, in a single architecture, it needs to be based on something that is simple. Simple yet flexible. And so for us, we felt that the underlying key value store architecture is something that fits that bill. It also is one upon which we are able to, unlike many of the newfangled architectures out there, the document stores that you might see from a MongoDB or a Couchbase, we are fully capable of and have a track record of maintaining full ACID transactional compliance. We also are obviously able then to step down, and as we do step down, improve the performance, because you don't have to ensure the ACID compliance, but still to be able to do CRUD, particularly where it's simply a write-intensive environment like we find out in an IoT space to handle time series data. But again, that simple environment, that simple architecture, excuse me, not environment, the simple architecture enables us to handle that environment. The other thing that when we talk about that simple architecture is that our entire code base is written in C, C++. And what that allows us to do is to easily move it from one operating environment to another, easily enable it to work in a virtual environment, whether that virtual environment be a virtual machine from VMware, a virtual machine on hypervisor for a Microsoft, or even a virtual machine running from Citrix. It enables us to also handle even more transient states that you find very useful in this, hyper fast, agile delivery environment for A/B testing, like using containers. So that's the reason that we believe starting with that simple, clear architecture enables us, has allowed us to continue to rapidly innovate and support the new environments, whether that be, as we said, the virtual environments, or for that matter, underlying that environment. Alex had mentioned that we now support ARM processors, not just Intel processors. We're starting to see out in the IoT environments that no longer do you see 16 or 32-bit microcontrollers with very limited resources. You're now beginning to see 64-bit ARM chips out there running in a Nest thermostat or something. So that's something to really understand when we talk about these enterprise-grade features, where they come from and why we're able to sustain them with this architecture over such a long period of time. We talked about the fact that we're continually improving the security. We talked about where you want to have that data at rest encrypted. We've gone from 128-bit encryption to 192-bit encryption, and soon we'll be up at 256. The other thing is that because these environments can be sometimes periodically disconnected, you want to make sure that you build in features and functionalities over and above the actual underlying data management architecture, supporting the management of that data management architecture. So things like auto reconnect are important. And so now the next couple of slides I'm going to go through really quick. There's no need to get into the details of them here. However, feel free to go on our website or talk to DaniSoft about getting the documentation that goes into detail about what's new as you move from each of our successive versions of P-SQL, from V10 to V11 to V12 to V13. And V13, of course, is where we've rebranded as Zen. I should mention, though, and it's pretty important, that if you are a user of V11 or V12, we highly encourage you to move up to Zen. Not just because at some point we have to begin to end support or provide a different model for payment around supporting the product, but the fact of the matter is that, and part of the reason we do that is that the underlying operating environments go through their own end-of-life process, their own migration or encouragement of you to migrate to the latest versions of things like Windows. So, for example, Windows 7, Windows 8.1, Windows Server 2008, all of these things are being end-of-life by next year. And if you've got a complex application that's mission critical in an enterprise-grade environment, well, you're going to need time to begin to migrate yourself, just your application code base. So with us, it doesn't mean that you're going to have to change any of the SQL or no SQL through Btrieve API calls you make with our product. No, you won't have to. You won't have to change anything in your code for that. Having said that, though, there's still the need to make sure that you can leverage all of that functionality and extend your application out into mobile and IoT to provide the ability to not just have that functionality in an on-premise remote client server environment, but also to move it into the cloud. So these are some of the features and reasons that you should move over to Zen. This slide gives you a bit of a reminder that with each of these movements from V9 to V10 if you were on pSQL, or V10 to V11 if you were on pSQL, and again V11 to V12, that in each of these cases, think about which version you are currently on and how many years behind that is, and the concerns that you should be aware of, and you probably are, that necessitate you moving to the latest version. And if you look at the aggregate of this, it's a lot of new benefits and features. And again, these are just a snapshot of what you can find in the what's new documentation as you move from each of these versions. And specifically for what's new in our latest and greatest version, we want to remind you that what we're enabling you to do now is the latest versions of Windows. So the latest version, Windows 2019, which has just come out, we have full support for that for both our Zen Enterprise server and the Windows Workgroup server. We also are increasing the speed at which you can move data across from one database, Zen database, to another, the block size, or for that matter, to any other database. The block size has been changed for buffering from 64 KB to 256. The size of the file in which your data table resides is increasing by 64x from a size limit of 1 TB to 64 TB. We've improved, as I mentioned earlier, the encryption for the advanced encryption system to 192-bit versus 128. And all of this we've done and yet maintain backward compatibility. So this is very important. Oh, and one other quick thing is, I don't know why I neglected to put it on here. We have Android and iOS support for Zen Core, and then for the Zen Edge product, we have Windows IoT Core support. So basically, and for that matter, any POSIX Linux compliant version, we have full support for. This sort of lists all of the different versions of Zen that you briefly saw in that diagram that looked at going from the cloud down to the remote branch, down to the gateway, and then further down to mobile handsets or to IoT devices. The various Zen versions are shown here and the differences between them. Most notably, there's differences in footprint. So obviously, if you're going to go down to a mobile device, then a footprint minimum you see here of 2 megabytes. Now, you may have much more in the way of resources and put much more data, but the actual client library that you would directly embed into the application you're developing, that would use a very little footprint of 2 megabytes. That can run on, that Zen Core can run on, again, Android or iOS, and then in turn, those operating environments can be running on an Intel or an ARM chip. And this would enable you to deal with any application you're embedding across smartphones or across sensors or gateways or whatever you might have out on that intelligent edge. And more importantly, if that gateway is handling multiple applications or data arriving from multiple devices, you're going to need to have a server function in it. And so what we've done is we've taken our classic pSQL and pared that down to about 30 megabytes and run on that the same bare bones types of environments that you would find on the actual devices where you'd run Zen Core. But here instead, you're able to actually do full-fledged client server from a database management standpoint. And you're able to do that between that gateway back up into the cloud or down to the core devices in a way where there's no ETL, as Alex explained earlier. As a matter of fact, that is one of the key things, is that unlike in a traditional environment where you may be choosing between us and Oracle database or Microsoft SQL or a myriad of databases, fact of the matter is, as you get out to the edge on a mobile handset or on devices as product managers begin to look at upgrading them to become more intelligent, what you probably are using today is some sort of proprietary or even a standard system. Proprietary meaning you built your own file system because you don't have a full operating environment. Or if you have a full operating environment, you're simply using the file system associated with that environment. if you start to look across multiple operating environments, then you end up with different file systems. And these file systems will mean that you have a lack of features and functionalities that are really necessary if you're going to leverage IoT for an enterprise in an enterprise-grade fashion. You have to be concerned with data inconsistencies, file corruption, fragmentation. The list goes on of all the issues. As a matter of fact, there is a much more detailed description of all of the issues that you're going to be faced with if you maintain using files as a way of doing it. The other option that we find out at the edge right now on mobile handsets or devices is SQLite. As a matter of fact, not just SQLite is open source, which you can pull off off of GitHub or wherever. You also find that it's been rebranded as Mongo clients or Couchbase clients or Berkeley DB. All of these are SQLite. And again, here we've actually done some description of why that's not the appropriate way if you're talking about really scaling up. If you want the same architecture, both client and server across devices, gateways, and into the cloud, SQLite is not the way to go. And by the way, you can look at our benchmark reports that we've had done by a third party that show it's also a very low performance, slow way of doing things by an order of magnitude or more, depending upon what you're doing. And more importantly, if you have to do the sort of ETL operations that Alex talked about earlier, those aren't just security vulnerabilities, they slow down your performance and they slow it down dramatically. So even if SQLite on that client was performant, which it's not, you still have to be concerned about getting the data back and forth as you are in most of these environments, and that's going to slow you down. Now, you might think, well, if I've got some of these newfangled modern architectures out there from companies like Couchbase, that's got to be faster. That's got to be more performant. And the answer is no. We've actually done benchmarks against Couchbase, and we've done the benchmarks against each of their products standalone. That is, Zen Core against Couchbase Lite. We are more performant than that, but we've also done the combinations of Zen Core plus Zen Edge or Zen Enterprise and Couchbase Lite plus their sync gateway, which is required in order to go from their client to their server, and of course, Couchbase Server. And the numbers are very impressive. Again, this is with a third party doing the benchmarks. And as a result, and this is just more of that same data, we find that again, using the right architecture to start with as the base is the way you build out something that's highly performant. Now, again, this is the actual database itself and the management of that database. But what you also have to be concerned with in an enterprise-grade environment is disaster recovery, synchronization, auditing. And we've built standalone components that support our databases and support them in these additional ways that are critical. So what I want to do is I want to turn it back over to Alex to talk a bit about how many of our customers are beginning to use our databases in innovative ways to handle these edge environments. And again, the Zen Edge, Zen Core, Zen Enterprise, Zen Cloud, all of these databases are used in conjunction with our data integration products and our backend in the cloud or on-premise in the data center analytics environments. And that's what's shown in this slide. So I'm going to turn it over to Alex now to talk a little bit about some of our customers.
Thanks, Louis. FloriLogic is a Canadian company that sells school management software to private schools. They describe it as ERP software for schools. And they're our favorite use case customer because of the way they have added to a T-SQL application that's been around quite a while. So their software includes modules for finance, student records, library, cafeteria, lesson plans, and more. They started many years ago as a classic client server on-premise application, and they've added a cloud component and a mobile component, and most recently an IoT-like feature for tracking students. the first implementation of their mobile component was for Android and iOS phones, and they used SQLite because that's what was available at the time. When they built this, they were still using Zen as a backend database. And so to add the SQLite database for mobile phones for their application, they had to write the ETL integration code that we've been talking about throughout the presentation. Once Zen Core became available, they swapped out the SQLite for Zen Core, got rid of the integration code, and now can very easily move data throughout their application. The newest feature that they've added is a student security feature. And what they've done is to take a Raspberry Pi and install Zen on it and put that Raspberry Pi on a bus. And the Raspberry Pi will read student IDs when they get on the bus in the morning. Students have RFID badges, and will record when and where the students get on the bus. As the bus arrives at the school, the Raspberry Pi will connect to the school's local server and upload all the student arrival information. And so that's a very nice added benefit. And because they are using Zen databases throughout their stack, it was a fairly straightforward addition. Here's another example of a customer who is thinking about re-architecting their application. And I'm sure this is true for many of you folks on the webinar right now. SS&C sells property management applications. It has unit tracking, tenant relations, payment portals, lease administration portals, work order request, anything you need for a full-blown property management application. It's currently client server and it's on premise. They hired a brand new manager of development whose job it was to come in and re-architect their application. And like many of the people that we talked to, his first plan was to build out a full open source stack. After we had a chance to talk to them about something they didn't know, which was we now have Zen on mobile platforms and single board computer platforms, and it's all the same data format that we've been talking about, and that when they were going to have to re-architect their application, if they were going to put open source databases in each of the places that they were going to have an application component. So what they were really going to do was to add mobile and move it to the cloud and turn it from a perpetual license business into a software as a service business. They were going to need to write a lot of integration code. So the kind of summary of this story was they are now reevaluating their OpenStack approach and looking at Zen as a single data platform throughout their entire application stack. And last but not least, in fact, last but largest, Sage is our single biggest Zen OEM partner. They sell several applications with the Zen database embedded to thousands and thousands of their customers. This example is ERP software for construction business. And a really big deal for Sage is that their customers never ever see a database. It's essential to their support economics that the end user can install the application, which automatically installs and authorizes the database, and that the application drives everything that needs to happen in a database, which is a classic use case for us. The main thing for Sage is that our zero DBA capability means that their support people never have to deal with database issues tied to the customer. In other words, all they ever have to manage is application issues. And this is also true because we have become very good over the last 30 years at delivering patches and version upgrades without having any requirements to do anything to the application. It's just a simple, typically a very simple install and you're done. And so that I'd like to thank everybody for attending today, and thanks especially to Danisoft for organizing the webinar and letting us talk to you. I think now we're going to do the raffle, and if you have questions, now's a great time to ask them, or you can reach out to Danisoft, of course, after the webinar. Oh, and this link here at the bottom, esd.actian.com, that's where to go download these products if you want to go do a test drive. So I think Daniel and Helena, over to you for the raffle.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Louis. I would encourage everyone to post questions in the meantime, and I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. I hope everyone can see my screen right now. We've got this, tiny, simple tool where I put names of all the participants. And we've got 3 licenses of Zen version 13, Enterprise Server, Cloud Server, and Workgroup. And I'm gonna draw the winners now. And we've got the winners. So we've got Emilio, Carmen, and Laura. Congratulations.
Congratulations. Woo-hoo.
Well, I'd like to add in again for Alex and myself, Louis, that we really appreciate your time today. If you have additional questions after the fact, please don't hesitate to contact Danisoft or to contact Helena, Alex, or myself. We'd be happy to continue the dialogue. Again, an hour is very difficult to get across everything that we're so excited about when it comes to Actian and Zen. Well, if there aren't any questions, I'll turn it back over to Daniel.
Yes, I don't see any questions at this time. Thank you, everyone. This session is recorded, so if any of you need the recording, yes, request it to us at the normal email address, info@danisoft.com, for example, and we will send the details for those that want the extended version of trial, and we'll send those by email. And that's all. Thank you, guys. Thank you, everyone. And that's all. Thank you.